I want to talk just briefly about this third eye center business because it turns out to be pretty interesting. The third eye is actually a name that's been given to another neural structure, or I should say structure because it's not strictly neural, and that's the pineal gland. And this has an interesting history. I promise I'm not taking off on a tangent here that isn't relevant to meditation. So you have a brain, of course, and on both sides of your brain, you tend to have mirror symmetric representations of the same things. What do I mean by that? Well, you have a prefrontal cortex on the right, you have a prefrontal cortex on the left, and they actually do slightly different things.
The pineal gland, canarium, or epiphysis cerebri is a small endocrine gland in the brain of most vertebrates. The shape of the gland resembles a pine cone, which gives it its name. Language is sometimes lateralized to one side, but in general, for every structure that you have on one side of the brain, you have the same structure on the opposite side of the brain. There's one clear exception to that, and that's the pineal gland. The pineal gland is the gland that makes melatonin, which at night, when it gets dark, secretes melatonin, and that melatonin makes you sleepy. It helps you fall asleep but not stay asleep. Descartes, right, the philosopher Descartes, asserted that the pineal was the seat of the soul because it was the one structure in the brain that he saw was not on both sides of the brain. It was only one of them and in the middle. Now, I don't know if it's the seat of the soul or not. I'm not in a position to make assessments like that. But what do we know about the pineal? The pineal, as I mentioned, is involved in releasing melatonin. It does a few other things as well. But it is also considered the third eye for a couple of reasons. One is that it responds to light, although in humans, not directly. So in birds and lizards and snakes, they actually either have a thin skull or, believe it or not, two holes in the top of their skull that allow light to go directly in. If you look at the head of a snake, light can go directly into their brain through these holes and activate the pineal to suppress melatonin and control their wakefulness, sleep rhythms. Melatonin is a hormone that's mainly produced by your pineal gland. Your pineal gland releases the highest levels of melatonin when there's darkness and decreases melatonin production when you're exposed to light. Because of this, melatonin has often been referred to as a sleep hormone.
In birds, they don't have holes in their skull, but they have very thin skulls, and believe it or not, light can penetrate the thinness of the skull in many birds and communicates information about time of day and even time of year, and that's translated into hormonal signals such as melatonin release from the pineal. And so the pineal has been called the third eye because it's a light-sensitive organ inside the brain. In humans, the pineal sits deep, deep, deep to the surface, and light cannot get in there. In fact, if light can get into your brain, unless you are part of a specific experiment where that's the intention, or you're having neurosurgery or something of that sort, then you've got serious issues happening. That pineal sits deep, deep, deep near what's called the fourth ventricle, and it absolutely should not see light directly. So the idea that the pineal is the third eye in humans is not true. It just isn't true. So anytime someone says, oh, the pineal is your third eye, that's not the third eye center that people are referring to when they talk about.
You can live without your pineal gland. However, your body may have a difficult time with sleeping patterns and other physiologic functions related to the circadian rhythm without a pineal gland due to a lack of melatonin.
Now, you'll see a number of different forms of art where somebody will, it'll be a picture of a face and the eyes will be closed or sometimes open. There'll be literally a third eye, like a cyclops eye in the middle of the forehead. That has been proposed for many thousands of years to be, quote unquote, the seat of our consciousness. Now that's interesting because that real estate behind the forehead actually turns out to be the prefrontal cortex, which we know from lesion studies and stimulation studies. If you remove that brain area, people become very reflexive. They are not thinking intentionally. They don't become deliberate. In fact, and this is kind of an eerie result, but if you inactivate, you turn off the prefrontal cortex and you give somebody the opportunity to play a shooting game, for instance, their accuracy goes through the roof. They become essentially like a machine. They see a stimulus, they shoot at it. They see a stimulus, they shoot at it. Their accuracy is exceptional, but their ability to distinguish between enemy and friend completely disappears. So they become a highly effective motor, or I should say sensory motor machine, but their assessment and their judgment about right or wrong completely disappears.
Meditation is a practice in which an individual uses a technique, such as mindfulness or focusing the mind on a particular object, thought, or activity to train attention and awareness and achieve a mentally clear and emotionally calm and stable state.
This is also true for people that have prefrontal damage. They often will have inappropriate behavior or a hard time suppressing behaviors, etc. So the third eye center as the seat of consciousness and our intention is something that makes sense generally with what we know about the neuroscience and neurology. But there's something more to it that I think is especially important for all of you that goes beyond anything about ancient traditions or pineals or birds or snakes and pits in the top of the head. And here's what it is. The brain itself, meaning the brain tissue, does not have any sensory neurons. What do I mean by that? Well, if I touch the top of my hand, I can feel that. If I want to sense my heartbeat, if I work at it, I can feel that. If I want to sense how I feel internally at the level of my stomach, is it full, is it empty, am I hungry, is it acidic, does it ache, or does it feel pleasant, etc., I can sense that. And that's because we have sensory neurons on our skin and in our body, etc. We also have sensory neurons in our eyes that let us perceive things externally. We have no sensory neurons on our brain. This is one of the reasons why you can remove the skull and do brain surgery on somebody who's wide awake and be poking around in there, and they don't need any anesthetic on the brain itself. They need anesthetic for the incision site, but they don't need anesthetic on the brain because it has no feeling. You have emotions, but there's no feeling.
When we pay attention to our breath, we are learning how to return to and remain in the present moment to anchor ourselves in the here and now on purpose.
So normally we are perceiving and paying attention to what we are sensing, either externally, sights and sounds, again, exteroception, or internally, interoception, touch, etc. But by focusing our perception and our attention not on our bodily surface like a body scan, but to a point a couple centimeters or inches behind our forehead, we essentially are bringing that attentional, that perceptual spotlight to a location in which there is no sensation. There's nothing to feel there. And when we do that by closing our eyes and focusing on that quote unquote third eye center, which is the prefrontal cortex, to be quite honest, when we do that, something else happens. And what happens is when we are not thinking about and perceiving our sensations, because there are none there, our thoughts and our emotions and our memories sort of mushroom up. A better way to put it would be that they geyser up and take on more prominence in our perception. What I mean by this is that normally, I'm not thinking about the contact point between me and this chair, but as I'm speaking, I'm in contact with the chair and those neurons are firing. But if I focus my energy and attention on them, they're going to fire the same, but more of my perception goes there. Similarly, I'm thinking things all the time, you are too, and I'm perceiving things all the time, and I'm remembering things all the time, and I'm anticipating things all the time about the future. But by focusing my attention on the one organ for which I have no sensation, that is my brain.
While meditation isn't a cure-all, it can certainly provide some much-needed space in your life. Sometimes, that's all we need to make better choices for ourselves, our families, and our communities.
Well then, thoughts, feelings, and memories, feelings meaning emotional feelings, start to grow in their prominence, in my awareness and in my perception. And so this is why when you sit down to a meditative practice, if it's a meditative practice where you close your eyes or you're focused on that third eye center, where you're focused on your brain as opposed to your bodily surface or something external to you, the thoughts seem to come by in waves and they can almost be overwhelming. It's very hard to, as it's often described, just sit back and watch your thoughts go by because there are so many of them. Actually, the best way to stop thinking is to really focus on something external or to focus on sensation. That's less thinking than it is perceiving senses. Okay, so I don't want this to get too abstract. When people talk about the third eye center, they're not talking about the pineal, they're talking about prefrontal cortex. And when you direct your own attention to the very area of your brain that directs attention, there's nothing to sense there. The only things that will become present to you are feelings, emotions, that is, thoughts, and memories. And they will often arrive in what seems to be a very disorganized fashion. And the reason they arrive in somewhat disorganized fashion is because Normally, we just don't perceive things that way. Normally, we are splitting our attention, our perception, that is, to multiple things, our sensation and our thoughts.